and to Peadar for again coming in within time, and Baldur for pointing out that the challenge of how the political institutions and cultures in Iceland come together to manage conflict and the power struggles that still go on there, and Peadar while reading that both models are resilient, to give that sense of optimism, that maybe the clean out in Ireland has been more clear cut, and that the lively debate does point to the possibilities that exist, and that maybe Robin's pointing out of the possibilities of passive revolution are not quite there yet, that we're in a time and a space where we can conjure up change out of the space. So, and we've managed to come in pretty much on the right side of time. We've a good 50 minutes for debate before we hand over to Nat to sum up, so we can go right up to 4 o'clock with contributions from the floor, and we can, because of that, we can have a slightly different, possibly, conversation across the floor as well as a dialogue with this table. So let's open up to a broad conversation about the possibilities of taking the lessons from the Nordic model and elsewhere, taking what we've heard this morning about the importance of values, the importance of democratic and governance and political institutions, both national and international, and where that leaves us as we position ourselves facing change now. So, we're going to start here.
It's Donald Story. I work for the European Foundation for the Improvement of Living and Working Conditions. I'm head of employment research there. We're the only Swedish passport holder in the room, actually, and despite what the Norwegian gentleman suspected. Let me say three things. I just want to underline some of the points made very well by Torben and Robin about the Scandinavian model. And I want to make some sort of general comments and then some ideas on how concretely, what parts of the Nordic models we could take forward. This concept of universal social insurance is critical for the Nordic model, and I really hope I'm not repeating this unnecessarily. I really hope that people do understand how important it is. It's universal in that all residents can partake of it, and all income is subject to social contributions from this. This gives the model, this is one element whereby the model has this incredibly strong work orientation. That it's a very, very strong interest for you to be in the system and in the system by working. The best example, a way that it really sort of hits home to people, I think, is the parental leave system. The parental leave system is I'm talking about the Swedish system. The Swedish system is you get 1 year, a certain percentage of your pay if you take care of your child. So this is sort of money for nothing, you may think, money to be off. But what it actually does, it creates an incredible incentive, especially for Swedish women at a very early age, to participate in the labour force, to be part of the system, so that then when you become pregnant, or whether it's the father that does it, you can avail of this. So this work orientation of a social insurance type of a system is incredibly strong. Also, Torben touched upon it. This is active labour market policy. It is actually, quite a tough regime. In some ways, quite a tough regime. It's a part of the work test. Someone asked me one time, is it active labour market policy? Is it a carrot or a stick? And I said, well, it's a carrot. If you don't bite, they'll hit you on the head with it. It's an offer to participate in training. Decent training, and if you don't do that, if you don't take up that work orientation, that offer, you will be sanctioned. It's very, very important. And also this sort of work orientation, also touched upon by Robin, I think, that the amount of means tested is very, very limited. You didn't actually make the argument about the work incentive, but that's also a very important reason. Child benefit, the idea that it would be means tested, totally impossible in Sweden. There are many, many more things I'd like to talk about. You really don't want me?
No, I just want to make sure that I get in enough people, so not to cut you off. What you're saying is very valuable, but just to share the space.
Okay. There was a question earlier about the Finnish success, or about unemployment. Of course, Finland was not successful in the 90s. They made a lot of mistakes. Sweden and Denmark were more successful. And it's partly a vigorous active labour market policy measure, and also a lot of very innovative measures in Sweden, which some of you are interested in, I could talk about more. Also, I don't want people to get the perception that, at least in Sweden anyway, that the benefits are adequate. I would not say they're generous. And certainly if you speak to a Swedish trade unionist about the unemployment benefit system, it's not generous. It's supposed to be a transition, it's a transition insurance. 2 families unemployed with a mortgage, they could do it for a year, 2 years, maybe, but really not much further. You know, they aren't terribly generous systems actually. What we can learn about it, okay? I think there already is a discussion in Ireland about universal healthcare. Again, some speakers have taken that up. That is an option, and not least it's an economic option, because it's very, very clear that universal healthcare, sometimes people mix up efficiency and cost. It's the cheapest form of healthcare, and that is definitely possible. Childcare is also definitely possible. There are good economic arguments for it, and also education. There is still no debate whatsoever in Sweden that university fees should be charged for students. The debate doesn't exist, and unfortunately, of course, it does exist in Ireland. Let me stop there. Thank you much.
The Celtic Group and United Left Alliance. I think that it's very, very clear from the proceedings today that the Nordic model is very much superior from the point of view of humanity to what exists in Ireland, and our understanding of that has indeed been deepened today, and I'm very thankful to TASC for putting on this conference. But perhaps the lesson I would like to focus on from the Nordic experience is something that I'm thankful to David Begg for, which is his little film of the 1931 trade union conflict. Because I think it would be foolish to think that the Nordic models arose because of the superiority of ideas alone, or anything like that. It's quite clear that the Nordic models arose from very, very important battles fought by the ordinary people of those countries, and that the Nordic people and the Nordic trade unions and the Nordic social democracy enforced a compromise, I suppose you might call it, within the framework of capitalism, which was vastly superior to anything that was ever enforced in Ireland. And of course that didn't come down from the sky either. You know, to suggest as a throwaway remark that it's all due to the Civil War that we have such a weak labour movement in Ireland, well, I certainly wouldn't agree with that at all, because people of my tradition believe that there has been a continual failure of the leadership of the Irish trade union movement and the Irish labour movement since the time of the Civil War, and indeed before, since Connolly, and that we had a continuous situation of compromise with different vested interest groups, rich interest groups here, so that we have never really escaped from what is almost a neo-colonial industrial structure, epitomised perhaps by our dependence on sole dependence almost on foreign direct investment, leading to a situation where gross fixed capital formation here in Ireland declined, would you believe, by 30 billion in this tiny economy from 2007 to 2010, in accordance with the recent NIE figures. And just to jump ahead, not for another time, I think that we have to question, and I'm a trade unionist, coming from a trade union family, with a long history in the trade union movement. There are serious questions to answer for the leadership of the Irish labour movement, and both in its trade union and political wings. I think if we read the minutes of the National Economic and Social Council during the boom, where both IBEC, the trade unions and the state were represented, if we read the minutes of I'll finish up now, of the central bank, on which the trade union movement was represented right through the boom, and when the 90 billion was borrowed abroad, if we read through those, there are questions that have to be answered. Now, we have guests here today, and I have to be a little more polite than I usually am in those circumstances, but you'll see the full story on my blog, How It Too Failed Us. But I just want to finish up by saying this, and I was heartened by Peadar's remarks, that there are new left-wing forces in Ireland, and I also remember the Gramsci's words, which were quoted early on, that we mustn't miss an opportunity. And I can just say to you that we, in the new developments on the left, we are very, very determined not to miss such an opportunity. And indeed, anyone who wants to join with us in making sure we don't miss the opportunity, I can assure you we are a very, very open movement, and we're very, very determined, and we're determined that the totally unbalanced situation that has existed in this country right up to the present and led to the current debacle will not continue.
Okay, thank you.
Reetta Suomperä. I'm a Finn, but I work for, I'm an economist with Irish Business and Employers Confederation. So I've, as you can imagine, my perspective might be slightly different than those of some of the other commenters that we've heard today so far. I have a few points I'd like to make. First of all, in terms of the Nordic models and the importance of taxation, I think it's very important to make clear that if Ireland wants to move to that kind of a situation, it's not a case of people on high incomes paying more tax. In Ireland, we currently have a very high marginal tax rate of 52% already. That really is, even in a Nordic context, quite high. And people at middle and higher incomes, their income tax burden has ramped up quite significantly during this crisis. We have independent analysis from the SRI, for instance, showing that where the discrepancy really is between, say, Finland and Ireland is for people at lower income end of the spectrum. In Finland, you would start paying tax much sooner at much higher rates than you would in Ireland. So that is just an important consideration to bear in mind, and it's really that hollowing out of the tax base that happened in Ireland from 2001 to 2007, funded by unsustainable revenues from the property sector. That is going to be extremely difficult to deal with in the coming years. The other point I want to make is around importance to make a distinction between the financial sector and the real economy. If you talk to most IDAC members, they're incredibly angry about what the banks have done. Their businesses have been severely affected. They've had to let people go, and that's not something that they've done joyfully. They have restructured, and will be releasing a report, I think, next week, looking at the very ambitious growth plans that Irish firms have for their businesses in Ireland, in terms of turnover, but also in terms of staff. We have to make sure that whatever we do in terms of the crisis does not stifle that. Yes, we need a global economy that's functioning, but also domestically we need to make sure that that kind of entrepreneurial capability that is very strong in Ireland is not stifled.
That might be enough to keep us going. Just one more quick one.
Yes, so a question about corporation tax, and then finally in terms of the political system, I'm perhaps a little bit less optimistic in terms of the change that we've had. We have a government that has shown that they're not actually making evidence-based policies at the moment. They're taking incredibly short-term decisions, and also I think anyone who's read the Irish Times this week or last week, kind of political cronyism of appointing your favourites onto boards is still very much alive. So I do agree with Peadar in the sense that we need to keep pressure on government to improve and do better. So I think it's important that politicians actually become mature and responsible in terms of the kind of policies that they pursue.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just come back to the panel because quite a lot has come up.
I've spent all my life listening to left-wing people fighting against one another. Of course, we can criticise the quality of leadership across all our institutions, left, right and centre, and I'd be the first to do so. I think it's appalling by and large in Irish society. But I'm on the left. I think for the first time in my life there's an opportunity to build up some movement. Of course there are differences, but this is a time to come together, to start analysing fruitfully, I think, the sources, the different traditions we have on the left, and to start talking together about how we coalesce around a strategy for building a new model. I see nobody on the left raising this issue with the sole exception of David Begg, and I give him great, great credit for that. And I include the ULA in what I'm saying.
thank you. Robin, there was a few questions there that were directed at from our Swedish, half-Swedish colleague in relation to the things about the nature of the universalism and the taxation that you were talking about, and maybe to take the Finnish.
Yeah, I think in fairness that they were really just affirmations and elaborations, and I'm grateful for all of those. Obviously, I agree with.
So just the microphone.
Sorry, I beg your pardon.
Thanks.
That was my microphone. All of those were affirmations and elaborations which I happily agree with, and thank you for those. On the point about optimism versus pessimism, I always go with another Gramsci idea, which he got from, I think, from Romano, and it encapsulated in his slogan, pessimism of the intelligence, optimism of the will, which, to my mind, necessarily combines a tendency to err on the pessimistic side when one looks objectively at the world, to avoid rose-tinted glasses, while at the same time the tendency to err towards optimism when it comes to taking political action because of the importance of self-belief and what you can achieve. But I do think, as I was trying to argue in my presentation, that ideas matter. I think there is a serious deficit in the necessary ideas to find a new model in Ireland. That's why I think the Nordic model, while not perfect by any means and quite different from country to country, is so relevant to us. And I do think, I agree with Peadar, that I think that the only person in leadership in Ireland who has realised that is David. On the Finnish colleagues' points, I'd say three things. First of all, that I think there is scope for further taxation of incomes at the very high level, I mean over €100,000 kind of level, in order to deter rent-seeking behaviour by those at the top of the income scale. I think secondly, there is a huge issue that arises from the failure, going back to Gareth Fitzgerald's time in the 70s, to bring in a wealth tax in Ireland. And thirdly, of course, going back to the 70s again, the decision by Fianna Fáil to abolish domestic rates was a disaster, and there is a need for a property tax of some kind. On entrepreneurship, when you were talking, I was thinking of Keynes' famous reference to finance, saying that it makes a great servant but a bad master. And the big problem from an industrial point of view in Ireland, as indeed elsewhere, of course, is that finance has become the master. And again, to take Keynes' phrase of the capitalism of the casino, people have, in finance, have made the self-serving argument over the last number of years that they're wealth creators. In fact, they're not. For the most part, they simply gamble with other people's money. And those who are wealth creators have certainly found themselves, here as elsewhere, finding it very difficult to get credit lines in recent times, as banks have been rebuilding their balance sheets. Lastly, on your point about appointments and patronage, I would have mentioned, if it didn't have the time, again, a symptom, as I said, or a feature rather of the Nordic model is impartiality in government, and the absence of any proper public appointments system in Ireland is a huge problem. The people are not getting appointed on merit in a transparent way, but there still is a power of political patronage that has to come to an end, as TASC indeed has itself recommended, for a whole host of reasons, apart from the fairness or unfairness of the appointments themselves. In terms of building trust in institutions, events like the ones you referred to this week have certainly done nothing to enhance trust in that way.
Short points. I'm always struck by the number of times that the government says we can't do that because the Constitution doesn't allow us. And my question is, do the Nordic countries have a Constitution? And should we in Ireland look at changing the emphasis in the Constitution on private property rights and instead tilt it more in favour of the common good? And my second question is, the ambassador talks about the state being back on the stage, but in Ireland the state's not back on the stage yet. We are still very, very reliant on PPP, public-private partnership, to build infrastructure. And my question is, why can't the government build the National Children's Hospital and the primary care facilities, all of which have been passed in the recent public expenditure sanctions, by direct labour? And I don't accept union arguments that would be competition on pricing. I don't think that's a good enough argument. And lastly, I wonder, do the Nordic countries have a NAMA? Because it seems to me that NAMA would be a very good instrument to create jobs.
Thank you.
A question which is really directed to Peadar and to Robin. My name is Paul Leach, Guy Architecture. We have a bond with Nordic colleagues going back 27 years, and we're very aware of the culture in the Nordic countries, which has a profound environmental commitment, not only rhetoric, but commitment. And the question that I want to come to is about what was mentioned the other night at the book launch, pathologies within our democracy. There are, in my opinion, very real pathologies. Two of them would be the resistance to tax. We have failed, in terms of social anthropology, after a century, the people have failed to identify with the state. And Mary, you might have a comment on this too. So that's the first pathology. What's wrong that we don't willingly give, as we do to Somalia, to the state to build schools, hospitals, and so on, like the previous speaker just said. And the second one is the tendency to elect a rogue. He's a rogue, but he's our rogue, and he's building a casino in the middle of Tipperary. It's madness in the middle of the current situation. And I finish with, I took great heart from the Schumpeter reference that these moments, and I agree with Peadar, and I think your book is very timely, and it stands on the shoulders of your previous book. This is a crucial 7 years. Michael D may be like the child of Prague, highly polished, no power up on the shelf. If I know Michael D, he'd be down off the shelf.
My name is Peadar Thompson, and I'd better declare an interest in that I'm a volunteer of Stephen Donnelly, the independent TD for Wicklow. I'm obviously prejudiced in his favour, but I ask people to go to his website, www.stephen.donnelly, I think it is, .ie, but you'll get to it, and read some of the articles he's been writing for, of all papers, which greatly surprises me, the Sunday Independent, which helped to get us into this mess in the first place by advising people to vote for Fianna Fáil in 1997, but that was a long, long time ago. He has analysed the problem very well, and also I saw a most interesting documentary on the television station More 4 last week called The Flaw, and you can see that at www.theflawmovie.com. Both Stephen's contributions and the movie The Flaw have this in common, and I'd like to put it as a question to the panel. That is the destructive dominance of the finance industry, to which Robin has referred. It seems that this industry is all-powerful, that it is more powerful and not just than the Irish government, but more powerful than any government, even the United States. It seems we will have to tackle this eventually on a global basis, but in the meantime, is there something we can do as Europeans to considerably reduce the rewards which these people make to themselves and the inequalities which result from that, which are very, indeed, brilliantly delineated in The Flaw movie, which is an American production, as I understand. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Mary Farrell, AHCPS, and I'm responding to a Finnish colleague from IBEC who spoke to the floor. She's right when she says that the rate of tax for middle earners has been ramped up, but the rate of tax for lower earners has been really ramped up by the introduction of the universal social charge. So they are in, and they're making a very good contribution. I agree with Robin Williams, there is scope for the higher paid to pay more tax, but I'm not entirely certain that we should be targeting a figure as much as targeting the continuing tax reliefs and exemptions, which allow very highly paid people to pay very low effective rates of income tax. And I think that's the one that the immediate focus should be put on. The second thing I would also agree with Robin Williams on is the failure to enact a wealth tax, and I believe where we left the gaping hole in the tax system was in the abolition of property taxes and in the failure to legislate for a wealth tax, including a wealth tax on agricultural property. And if we want to bridge or fill that hole, I think we're going to have to go back and fill those spaces again. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Patrick Multy's my name. I'm a Labour Party TD, and first of all, apologies for being late into the discussion. I understand it's been an excellent debate. I just wanted to make two very quick points, if I may, and one is to agree with Peadar Kirby, with the political side of how we develop these models. It's absolutely crucial that those of us who are concerned with developing a more equal and more progressive society bunch together around issues where we agree. And I think we can agree on 2 points and campaign and advocate on 2 points. Number one, that crude cuts do not equal savings. For example, in areas like youth work, in areas like investment in education. If we invest in those types of things now, that is, first of all, a very efficient and effective use of public money. But secondly, it will actually lead to further economic growth, further tax buoyancy, and a more developed economy, similar to the knowledge economies developed in Scandinavian countries. And the second thing we can, I think, unite around is the need for investment to create jobs. That's why we have to continue to push for capital projects that may not have been agreed to last week, but things like Metro North, things like large public infrastructural projects which will create jobs, because it's through investment and growth that we will deal with our structural deficit, and it's through investment and growth that we will generate the tax base to provide the type of social services that are there in the Nordic model. And just secondly, to say as well, around the taxation issue, because that's come up, I do believe that maybe we do need to increase our tax base, but in order to convince the public of that, people at the top will have to lead by example. In 1997 we had a capital gains tax rate of 40%. I don't see why we can't have that now. Michael Noonan in the Dáil in June was asked about a wealth tax similar to the model they have in France, which is quite moderate, but he replied that if it was implemented in the Irish context, it would generate between 400 and 600 million euro per annum. And they're the type of policies I think we can advocate for in a very considered and a very reasonable way. And if we can convince people that those who have most are paying most, then we can have a much bigger debate in our society about the need to tax and invest in services. And I commend TASC again for organising this excellent seminar. Thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Now, just a lot of questions there. I was going to maybe say that maybe Pertti and Baldur might take up the question of NAMA, maybe the whole issue of the financial, destructive nature of the financial industry and regulation, and maybe Robin and Peadar, there's a lot there on the pathologies, the resistance to taxation, and the comments more generally around taxation from Peter Mary and Pat Multy. Would that be okay? Yeah. If you want to take the floor, Pertti.
Thank you. Are you? No, not yet.
No, you're okay.
Okay. There was a question firstly concerning the role of the Constitution in the economic policy questions, and you understand I'm neither competent nor willing to comment the Irish Constitution over here, but as far as the Finnish Constitution is concerned, I don't see that we face often situations when making economic decisions that the Constitution would be making limitations, that we don't face. Jukka, you if you want to comment this, but I don't see that that is a limitation. One good example of the process what has taken place or took place during the Finnish recession was that in the parliament they could make decisions concerning the budget in terms of additions to the budget with a simple majority. That was before the recession, with a simple majority. But all the cuts require 2/3 majority. So I think that this tells how also recessions can introduce and produce very, very good administrative, even constitutional results. That for the Constitution. Then state, back on stage. I think how the financial economic crisis has been handled in the world, you must have noticed that it has been mainly business of the state. I cannot see that before the crisis, state either individually or together have been able to make such strong decisions together or solely. So I feel very strongly that this is a sea change. When we go further, for instance, within EMU and when the new permanent stability mechanism will be there, this will be further and strongly increasing the roles of the state within the European Union and EMU area. So the trend is there in my opinion, but if you see some other kind of symptoms, please tell. I don't see this not being a general trend at the moment. Concerning PPP in Finland is not a swear word. We still feel that there are very strong opportunities for private-public partnerships, and it depends on the project, it depends on the field and so forth, but this is an implement that is we try effectively implement and use in Finland.
Okay, thank you.
Get to know about Ireland, it strikes me how many similarities there are basically between the Irish case and the Icelandic case. What was mentioned here in the discussions was, for example, the resistance to tax. We have the same thing in Iceland. Failure to identify with the state. We have the same thing with in Iceland with a quite a big portion of the population. Clientelism, populism, the closeness of particular economic sectors to particular political parties. So I think there's an interesting case there which we, I think, need to study in more depth. And the present left of center government back home is heavily criticized for raising taxes, for regulating more closely the agrarian sector, our fish industry, and our traditional ruling Conservative Independence Party, which is gaining ground again in the opinion polls, is going to emphasize tax cuts in the next general elections. Tax cuts and lightly regulated sectors. Again, so we are back to the same picture. And the center-right government in the period from 1995 to 2009, it said it explicitly that it was created a new model, economic model for Iceland based on a neoliberal agenda. And this model was an alternative to what they referred to as the European model. It was an alternative and a much better model than the European model. What it meant really was, by the European model, was the Scandinavian way of doing things. In a way, this has been was a complete failure. That said, we don't know what will happen at the next general elections, which we have in 2 years' time. We might simply get back to the same business, which is extremely interesting, some would say worrying. It's a really fragile situation. We elected the first ever left of center parliament soon after the crisis hit. That was the reaction to the tough measures which the government is taking, a very harsh, heated debates, and the center-right might be back in power in less than 2 years. Thank you.
Do you want to? You can just make a very quick comment.
Well, I'll make a very quick comment. Paul mentioned it at the book launch 2 weeks ago, and he's mentioned it again. Yes, there are these pathologies in our political culture, and you've mentioned issues around which the left should be uniting, not fighting. And I mean, one thing that should unite all of us, from the moderate left way out to more radical left-wing groups, is that we want to build a strong state, a capable state, a state that has capacity to plan and to develop the economy and society. And we're not doing that. You know, that debate isn't taking place. So we have to confront this. And we do have a state that people don't trust, they don't want to pay taxes. So why? Because it hasn't capacity. Because they don't believe that if they pay more tax, that they're going to get better public services. And there's a lot of evidence as to why they don't believe that. So those are the agendas. Patrick Nulty, whom I welcome here and congratulate on his recent election, raised a number of issues, and I totally agree with him. I mean, it seems to me that one of the best ideas that Labour is putting forward is the Strategic Investment Bank. I think, again, here we should see strategic thinking on the part of the ULA, on the part of Sinn Féin, to support Labour in ensuring that we get a strategic investment bank that has real capacity and that can have a real role in investing in productive sectors of the economy. I see no strategic thinking going on like that on the left in Ireland, and that really depresses me, to be honest with you. Because if we can't make a breakthrough into some new way of cooperating together in the interest of a much bigger picture, then we're not going, I mean, this is going to be a missed opportunity, and it's going to be a failed revolution, as Robin said.
Thank you.
Just to pull a number of comments together for brevity, Fintan O'Toole makes a very good point in The Ship of Fools that Ireland never really experienced the post-war European moment when, as embodied, for example, in the formation of the Council of Europe in 1949 to promote democracy, human rights and the rule of law, Europe's post-war political class said never again to aggressive nationalism, intolerance and war. And it agreed the way to do that was to promote a set of universal values, a set of norms, which would act as a means to inoculate Europe against that cancer. In the absence of the embedding of those norms in Ireland, we do have constantly the problem of tax evasion, electing of rogues, and all the other ills to which people have referred. And in particular, there's a lack of understanding of what human rights means. Attracta Ingram, the political philosopher, made a very good point in a book some years ago on the political theory of rights, where what she said was that there was a tendency to think that rights derived to you as a property owner. And said, no, rights derive from our fundamental humanity. That's where human rights come from. But the conception of rights in Ireland is fundamentally, you have rights because you're a property owner. And you have therefore rights to do with that property as you see fit, and anything on the part of the state that challenges that, and of course it's potentially unconstitutional to do so, is a confiscation. And that's something we need to change.
I just want to, there's an awful lot one could follow, but I don't want to follow too much, except really to ask the Nordic people, in panel, indeed, in general, on three areas, what I would call roughly culture, order and discipline. I remember in 1975 visiting the Swedish Ministry of Industry to discuss whether we should have a state-holding company in Ireland, but they had stats for TAG. And I was told, well, yes, but he believed in market disciplines. And I think this is one of the interesting points today. It has come up indirectly about can the Nordic model be sustained unless there was an awful lot of market disciplines? In other words, that if you have high taxes, high welfare, social protection, active labour markets, going on with that is a strong economy. Now, it's a question of which comes first and how you go from A to B. And I think that the model, the second thing is, by contrast, a senior Greek official said to me a month ago that Ireland is the most Mediterranean country in Northern Europe. And Mr. Noonan said in the Dáil last week that Ireland was a Northern European country. Now, that is something to do with this order issue, that the white and the black economy, Greece's black economy is 25% of that. Let's sort of explore to ask the Nordics, are they as white as they appear? Is this question of order and reciprocity? Because you pay taxes, you have an efficient public service, and you have high benefits. Does that encourage whiteness? Now, I should stop because I'm conscious of time, but if I get this cultural order, discipline point.
So Yiddish Kelly from the Economic and Social Research Institute, and just during various presentations today, one of the features of the Nordic models appears to be social partnership and collective bargaining and its role that it's played in both boom times and during recessions. So my question is, our social partnership, especially emerged after the last recession in the 1980s, played a very prominent and major role. So I'm just wondering, does any of our speakers see a role for social partnership in the current environment?
Thanks, Alex.
Friends, I'm also from the ULA, member of the Socialist Party, Emmett Farrell. And this is the first conference I've been at, in 5 of them over the past 3 months, where there was an intervention of the type by Paddy Healy. Now, I just want to make a couple of points there, if you give me the time to make them, right?
Well, I
haven't heard the word class mentioned in those 5 conferences, nor the word socialism. I worked as an engineer in the building industry during the boom, and I met a lot of bankrupt architects and engineers that had discussions about why it happened and whether what was the future. And it was just incredible to understand that they had absolutely no understanding that there could be an alternative to capitalism. They could more conceive of the end of the world than the end of capitalism. Now, we talk about the Nordic model, but it seems that, and there's a lot to admire about it certainly, but it seems the discussion here is if it was self-contained. But there's a deepening crisis of capitalism, not just of financial capitalism, but of capitalism per se, capital accumulation, the lack of any profitable potential for investment. And as a result of this, like, how can the Nordic model be sustained? They have to export, clearly. And I'd just like if maybe somebody would come back on that. No, just in relation to the points made about David Begg. Unfortunately, I have to disagree fundamentally with them. A year ago today, 100 to 120,000 people were on the streets of Dublin, called by the ICTU. David Begg was speaking on the platform, Jack O'Connor and others. And there was a very significant disagreement with what they were saying. The audience, a lot of the people there were booing because they were getting no leadership. Now, the idea that there's some kind of significant proposal being put forward by the leadership of the ICTU, in fact, and in terms of social partnership and so on, the situation is that
I wanted to let everybody else in, so you've probably said enough that
I'll finish up.
coming back. Yeah.
Certainly, but David asked for indulgence for his points. I just want to make this point, and I want to make others, but I just make this one. David Begg and the leadership of the ICTU are providing no leadership at a time when I was a shop steward 40 years ago on the trade union movement in the Irish Transport General Workers Union. At that time, bad and all as they were, they would defend working people. They're not defending them now. And the problem is that working people are looking for leadership. They're not getting it from them. And just in relation to the arguments, I say that in relation to Peadar Kirby as well, Cambio, in relation to the trade unions, Cambio Model, yeah, we need it. Absolutely, we need it now. And we need people like yourself to get involved in the ULA, not lecturers from the sidelines, help us to build something. We haven't seen any of the people.
No, just in terms of letting the other 6 in that need to get in. Thank you, we've plenty to respond to there. Breed is next.
Ryan, Irish National Organisation of the Unemployed. Very interesting day, and I'll try and be brief. Just one thing that just struck me from this morning's, it was a slide that the colleague from the Norwegian Congress of Trade Unions had up. And what was so striking was that in the Nordic countries, how strong public sector employment is. And we're having this seminar on the day when the report has been launched, where they're going to show where they're going to cut public employment, sector employment even further, which I think is very interesting. And we have had, unfortunately, leaders of the Labour Party saying the state does not create jobs, which I find an extraordinary statement. A state can create jobs and should be creating jobs. And also the positive impact of public sector employment from a gender perspective. And in particular struck me when the gentleman spoke around teachers and respect for teachers in Finland. An awful lot of our young people are leaving college with degrees, and the obvious employer is the state itself, if the state itself is pulling back, which I think is very regrettable. In terms of question for the panel, what role has the media played in supporting the Nordic model in the Nordic countries? Because the role of the media in the current debate has been very negative, and it's been very difficult to the mainstream media to get any discussion and an alternative going at all, let alone having traction. Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Bruce. There's 2 more down at the very back.
From Claiming Our Future and also Equality Rights Alliance. It's just a very quick question, and Baldur is gone, so I don't know if anybody could answer it. I was wondering, what gave the Icelandic people the self-confidence to not bail out their banks? We know that they didn't have the ECB breathing down their necks, and we know that they were in a different situation. They had more options open, they could devalue, etc. But what strikes me as extraordinary is that we read now that they're back in the markets, and I'm sure there were no shortage of people telling them that if you do let your banks go, you won't be able to get back to borrowing again. Apparently not so. They're back in the market since early this year, and also they have got complimented by the IMF. because they've managed to reduce their inequalities or at least not exacerbate them. And we're heading into a second budget where, as IMF is pointing out, we're about to exacerbate them even further at 2-to-1 public spending cuts versus taxation. So I was just wondering, did all the Irish courageous blood go to Iceland back in the pirate days, or is it an independent woman Prime Minister, or what was it?
Economic Society of UCC. I'm here with a big delegation of students from Cork, and I suppose we're here today more to learn about the Nordic models and what we can learn from that, rather than basically hearing a lot of the Irish left fighting amongst each other. So to return to that topic, the Nordic models, resilience in changing times, I think we've learned some very interesting things today about childcare, about labour activation policies, education and kind of social protection. What I'm wondering is maybe one or two other crucial areas for the future. One would be, what kind of policies are the Nordic countries doing differently in relation to energy security? And the other is in dealing with crime, because they are two big, I think, issues of our time, I suppose, crime and drugs and things like that, and energy security. And just one final teaser question. A lot of people are talking about the fact that the euro might go by the wayside. Merkel has said that if the euro fails, Europe fails. If the EU does come apart along with the EU, would there be a chance that the Nordic Council would kind of institute a stronger, maybe single currency unit or some kind of organisation on that? Just a teaser.
A teaser question, you call that. Listen, thank you for making your comments so succinct. It was important to let everybody in, and I certainly wasn't trying to drown out any particular voice there. So just to make sure that at least we take as much as possible up in discussion now. Baldur was one of the trains, Robin is one of the, no, he was a plane, he's a train, so I think you might need to leave the platform soon, so I'm going to give you the first response there, Robin, and then move on to Pertti and Peadar. And Baldur did send apologies, but he had a plane at 6.
Yes, and my apologies, I'm going to slip out after I made these comments, but thanks everybody for all the very thoughtful questions and comments that you've made, which I'm very grateful for, and obviously a lot of them directed to the people rather than me, but I'm personally grateful for the ones that come my way. Just a few concluding points on finances. There are a lot of comments around finance. One of the huge problems about PPPs was a failure of economic literacy in government, in the sense of a failure to distinguish funding and finance. Because it was easy to finance things through PPPs, it was often not recognised that funding them would cost at least as much in many cases, or indeed some cases more, than under conventional forms of procurement. That remains a problem of economic literacy in government. Secondly, on the banks, Ola's point, in the 1990s when Sweden had the crisis to face up to, instead of giving a guarantee of all deposits, they took equity stakes in the banks, which achieved the goal of recapitalising the banks and therefore solving the crisis, but of course also meant they were able to sell off the stakes subsequently and make a modest profit in so doing. Also, while on the subject of finance, one of the ways to ensure it does remain a good servant and a bad master, of course, is to have an international financial transactions tax, and that's one way I do agree with Angela Merkel on. That's all on banks. Another point on markets, so generally on market discipline. Ironically, one of the things about the Nordic countries is actually they often make markets work better than they would if you left them to themselves. The Nordic model shows that, in fact, far from markets always leading to Pareto optima, if they're not regulated, in fact, they often fail, and they often work much better, like the labour market example that was mentioned, and others can be mentioned too, if they are, in fact, well regulated, have to be socially embedded in the phrase. And speaking of social embedding, order, discipline, etc., while the state is strong in the Nordic countries, doesn't mean it's authoritarian. Quite the opposite. The point is really that there is a great degree of self-policing in Nordic countries in terms, as was said about tax evasion and so on, and therefore one doesn't need to have authoritarian states. When I was in Copenhagen some time ago, I was there for a week before I noticed any policemen. I saw two eventually because somebody had been involved in some shoplifting, and it was hardly the most serious crime there is. And to take the point about crime, there's a very interesting book about antisocial behaviour, which of course is the kind of crime that often affects working class people most of the time, published a few years ago, which compared the UK with Sweden and the Netherlands, and the point was made that in Sweden, and this, unlike in the UK, and this would also be unlike Ireland, one would never get to a point where a teenager would be left to their own devices to the extent they popped up in the system as a young criminal before all sorts of public interventions would have taken place through the social services at a much earlier point to identify and tackle the problem. And lastly, on the welfare state and employment in it, and there's other things, but I don't want to monopolise the time, about the state and job creation. Yes, as was said this morning, the big employers in childcare and in elder care, and that has a whole host of positive benefits for work-life balance for women, for job opportunities for women, for ease of kind of pressures on domestic life, and so on and so on and so on. But there's also this idea in the Nordic case that social policy is a productive factor, so the state can create jobs. Through public health, through public education systems, you improve the productivity of your human resources, and therefore you're actually creating jobs through having jobs in the state over and above the jobs you create, and over and above the multiplying effect on demand of those jobs.
Thank you very much, Owen. Maybe just to give giving an impossible task to Pertti and Peadar, but maybe if you could just take maybe 1 minute to say the most thing at the top of your head. That's so before we hand over to Nat.
Thank you, Mary. This is a bit of a challenge, but there was a question concerning the institutions and trust in institutions and discipline and related. Finland, if I'm talking only about Finland, but I think the differences are not that big between the Nordic countries. There is a long-term trust in the institutions and civil service in our countries, and civil service is regarded to be the defender of the ordinary citizen. And I think that is the explanation. It is one of the values. It is hugely widely accepted and prevails. Then there was a question concerning criminality and crime. Over there we are partly facing new problems in terms of international criminality that is coming into Nordic countries from elsewhere, and measures tackling that one. But in general terms, the fight against criminality takes place through the normal system, investing in equality, equity, education, fair taxation, social and economic development, safety nets, well-functioning legal system, and so forth. This is our way, long-term influence and maintaining the system as fair as possible. Energy security, we have been describing you the huge differences and variety of the Nordic approaches and decisions concerning our political system and our defense arrangements and so forth. The same variety concerns very much our energy situations and energy security. Norway and Iceland hardly discuss anything about the energy security. That is not a burning problem. Denmark is going strongly towards wind energy and renewable energies with a very tangible success. Sweden is not in difficulties in this because they have a variety of their own sources plus cooperation with Norway. And Finland, we have made a very special decision within the European Union to increase the nuclear energy, and there we have again our own reasons. So this is the situation if the Nordic colleagues don't want to say anything more. Thank you.
Thank you. And Peadar.
Thanks, Mary. Yeah, I do think that it's been a missing issue, is the whole issue of energy and climate change, and again it seems to me the Nordics are taking the lead in very important ways on this. The question that was asked at the back about the Icelandic response is a very interesting one. It's a pity that Baldur, you didn't give it while he was here. He has a flight at 6. So I was telling him he was cutting it very fine. He wanted to stay till the end. My sense is I am struck in Iceland by the strength of discourse around sovereignty and nationalism. which takes me back to a past in Ireland, but that doesn't exist. I taught classes last week in the University of Iceland on Ireland's role in the EU and Irish foreign and security policy, and in both of them I had most fascinating conversations with students about this, how we read nationalism differently. And of course it's a very, very live issue in their political debate, the protecting sovereignty. So I suspect that the answer that Baldur would give would be that there is this sort of instinctive nationalism, you protect your own, which seems very embedded in the Icelandic psyche and political system. After all, what they did immediately was to close down the banks, to protect only the deposits of Icelanders, and then to set up one new functioning bank into which all those deposits were put. So effectively, they burnt their bondholders with one fell sweep. Now, however, of course, we mustn't forget that there are grave costs to this, that the krona isn't now tradable on international financial markets, and if people want to get euros or any foreign currency, they have to show either a ticket that they're going abroad, or they have to show evidence to support that they're due it. Now, this is very difficult for businesses, it's difficult for Icelanders. We must realise that there are benefits of having your own currency, but there are huge downsides as well. And if you read the report of ours that was launched here today, it was one of the things that I learned is the cost of devaluation, which we don't attend to. So that's only by way of an attempt at some initial answer. It's not adequate at all. The final thing I want to say is, the point made by this man over here about there being no discussion of class and of socialism, raises interesting points. Of course, we could talk about class, and we could talk about gender, and we could talk about ethnicity, and we could talk about sexual orientation. We could talk about many different ways in which issues around which there's a lot of inequality in our society. I don't privilege class, though of course class is a very vital and essential category. And at the beginning of our book, I carefully wrote a section in chapter 1 all about socialism and my understanding of socialism. So, be assured that this discourse about socialism hasn't died. But one doesn't need to be a member of the ULA to seek to promote left-wing thinking and left-wing activism. If one saw from the ULA or any other sectors of the Irish left the sort of cutting-edge leadership that I think is needed in Irish society, then perhaps I might be attracted to think that that's a place which would be worthy of one's energy. But I don't see that, to be honest with you. So, I don't feel I have to make any apologies for not being a member of any left-wing party, and yet being unashamedly on the left. I have been for all my life. I was not seduced by the neoliberal bubble, as some people on the left were, and I think in all my work I have been absolutely consistent. Would that other public figures and academics in Irish society have been consistent, so I don't make any apologies. And I think it saddens me that we're reduced to this level of sort of infantile discussion of trying to score points against one another, when what we badly need is to find, to foment a common debate. Of course there are differences among us. Of course there are differences on the left. There should be, we're not back to Stalinism or anything like that. But out of those differences, we really have values and we have a vision for Irish society, and let's try to hone that and to develop it and to win more adherence for it and to make it more credible and to make it a real contribution to the future of this society, rather than feeling that one's greatest enemy and one's greatest task is to try to show that David Begg isn't the leader that he purports to be. I will have none of that, because to me David Begg has been a lone figure. And I really admire what he's done, and he's got no support from any sector of the left or from any other sector of Irish society. So I just want to end off by saying I think this has been a marvellous day. I think it has allowed us to bring forward a really, really interesting set of issues, and the turnout itself I think is a really good sign of hope that there's a real interest in these sorts of issues. And as I said when I was speaking, I hope that this is the first of many. I commend TASC again. Of course, TASC's role is absolutely inestimable, but this was, I think, a really good idea. It's wonderful to have the different embassies collaborating in it. And, let's move on from here to develop these ideas more. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Peadar. And, just remains... It just remains for me to wrap up. We were talking about learning from other places and spaces, and to some degree, if we learn of the origins of the Nordic model, it did come about from an alliance of society who built together an agenda about what kind of society and economy and state they wanted. And I think to some degree that is the challenge for people who want a progressive change in Ireland, is to be able to find a common language to articulate what we want, not what we're against, but what we want, and to be able to find the language to sell that to Irish people in a way that they can see that they want it. That takes a change of values in where Irish people understand themselves to be at the moment. And I think whatever we're talking about as a way of trying to build from the fragmented spaces and places that we do our change work in, I do think that we're talking about a very long-term project of change, and that we need to dig in for the longer term. It is about building from these pieces of the jigsaw to articulate a different agenda, and then to build some public support and some public debate around that. It relates back to the role of the media. I think when we start putting meaningful debates into the media that have traction, that we will get much more response from it. So I think today has been invaluable in terms of another piece. Last month's conference by TASC likewise was really, really useful in enabling people to become much more articulate, talking about ideas and talking about the kind of society, economy and state that they want to have. And I think it's up to all of us, the different spaces that we're all working in towards, to hang on to that central idea that it's not what we're against, it's what we're for, and it's what we can articulate together that will actually make the fundamental change. So to thank TASC, and particularly to thank yourselves for what was a very quick round of contributions, but one that enabled a lot of people to get in and a lot of participation, and to thank particularly our remaining speakers, Pertti and Peadar, but also Baldur and Robin in their absence. Thank you.